Desperate times call for desperate measures.
In the last episode, you saw me purchase the cheapest Volkswagen T5.1 in the UK. The only thing is, it didn't run.
Okay, first things first, let's get the van in the garage.
The first challenge was getting a van which weighs almost 2 tonnes up my slopes driveway and into the garage where I could start working on it. The van doesn't actually have a towing eye supplied with it, so what did I do? I put the tow hook right around the subframe. With the rope hooked up, it was just a case of slowly winching the van up the drive, over the garage threshold, which is a bit of a steep ridge, finally pushing the van into position over the inspection pit where I could start to begin the work on it.
So there we have it. Hope you enjoyed that. Got the van inside the garage, which I'm chuffed about. But now we need to start having a think about what we're actually going to do with the engine. Obviously the timing belt cover is all off. I think it'd be wise for us to jack one end of the van up so we can actually put a socket on the end of the crankshaft and turn the engine over by hand, make sure it spins freely. Then when we've done that, let's get it up to TDC, because I've got the timing tools from when I did the timing belt and water pump on the PD engine. I think they're pretty much the same timing pins, so we can lock it into TDC and then go from there. Okay, so you don't actually have to take the wheel arch liner out because there's a nice little groove that enables us to get the socket on the end. So let's stick that on and see if it turns over. Look at that, fits in perfectly. Oh, she's stiff, I tell you. So as you saw there, managed to turn it over by hand, it was a little bit stiff. But what I'm going to do now is try and get the thing to TDC, try and get the timing tools in. As I said earlier, it should take the same timing tools as the 1.9 PD. And then I know that it hasn't jumped a tooth or anything like that. So let's see if we can do that now. There we have it, engine's at TDC. Got the camshaft locks, and then down there I've managed to put the crankshaft locking tool on. That's all timed up, so we know that hasn't skipped a tooth, so I guess on to the next thing. So I think what I'm going to do now is clean up the top side of the engine. The injectors are absolutely filthy, which I guess is to be expected from a high mileage engine. But in addition to that, I'm going to clean the valve cover. I'm actually going to take the valve cover off and just inspect the cams. So I think we'll jump straight into that. So thankfully for me, Volkswagen France have already pulled most of this bit apart, so I'm going to whip the injectors out, unbolt the valve cover, and looking at it, it should just lift off and we should be able to see the cams. There we have it, valve cover off and cams have been exposed. From what I can tell from a visual check, they all look okay, but what I'm going to do is give them a little bit of a clean up because there's little bits of crud and stuff that's dropped in here. And then I think what I'll do is take the timing tools out, turn it over a couple of times and just inspect all the lobes, but I can't see there being a problem here. I think what I'm going to do is a little bit daring, and I think I'm just going to crank the car, see if fuel blasts out that common rail. If it doesn't, that to me says the pump's at fault. You know, you need to be getting fuel at high pressure to those injectors for them to work. So let's see how that goes. So when I picked up the van, it actually did come with a box of spares in the back. Part of that box has the fuel lines in, so I thought what might be a wise idea is to take the fuel lines and bolt them onto the common rail part, put them all into a jam jar or something so we don't have diesel spraying everywhere as I'm cranking it. mean, that's a big if, that's if we actually have fuel pressure, but that would just add a slight element of control to the situation. So I think we'll give that a go. So I've taken the 4 fuel lines out of that blue box of parts. I've just bolted them onto the rail, nipped them up, they don't have to be mega tight, and then I've put some aerosol can caps underneath each one. All this is proving is we're going to get fuel, are we going to get fuel from that rail, from the pump? So yeah, I'm going to put some tape around here so it doesn't spray out, and then yeah, we'll see what happens. Let's do the tape now. There we go, so you've got some tape there. It's just to stop any excess diesel, if it squirts out, to go everywhere. So let's crank it, see what happens. So the plot thickens. I cranked it a couple of times. Initially I didn't get anything, but now if we look in my little plastic caps, we have fuel in each one. And this is why I put the caps on, so we didn't piss fuel everywhere. And yeah, they're all pretty even, to be fair, which is good. A little bit of crud in some of them, but I don't know if that's come out of the fuel line or just where the fuel lines are a bit rusty and they're just sitting in the cap. So yeah, where do we go from here? We've got fuel. Right, so another little bit of information that I've acquired from one of my friends who works at a garage. He passed through some images of the fuel pump that sits on these. That's the high pressure fuel pump that runs off the timing belt. And he said what can happen on the end, just before the fuel comes out the actual fuel line, there's a sprung kind of valve or solenoid. The spring can break and that can give you little to no fuel pressure. It looks like I can access it in situ without having to take the pump off. So I'm going to have a little bash of that now, see what we can find. So what I'm going to try and do is get the fuel line off the back of the pump. And I think I've managed to achieve undoing it with this ratchet and a crow's foot, which you can see. So I've managed to undo the end of the fuel pump in situ. You can see there's the fuel line and then 4 retaining bolts. Now let's pull it out and have a look. Right, so it's not that. That spring looks good, all intact. So let's stick that back on. So the end of the fuel pump is pretty tricky to get back on because you're fighting the resistance of that massive spring. So what I did was I put a long bolt on, then a slightly shorter bolt, and then did them up, which brought the spring in and allowed me to start putting in the original factory Torx bolts. So it's now going on, but yeah, that's a bit of a mission. Right, the end of the pump is bolted back down, so that's all good. Right, so I've put the engine back together enough to start thinking about a compression test, and I thought, do you know what, I might just turn it over, but rather annoyingly I'm missing the throttle body, or the throttle valve it's known as in the workshop manual, to mate that hose to the inlet. So yeah, I don't know really if I should do anything, or should I just go for it and turn it over? I mean, that would be maximum air going into the cylinders, so not sure what to say. Okay. Smoking. Yo, so yeah, you saw in those clips that the engine clearly wanted to fire up. And technically I'd say it did fire up and run. It sounded absolutely horrendous, but I'm not that concerned about the kind of the knocking noise that came with that running. It was more of like probably like a diesel knock, but obviously it wasn't running on diesel. It was clearly just running on the easy start. I suspect the high pressure fuel pump is not doing its job. It's not delivering fuel at a high pressure to actually get past those injector nozzles. So yeah, I mean, we saw earlier in the video we were getting fuel out of the fuel lines. That could just be from the fuel tank's pump through the high pressure pump and then into the fuel lines. It's the high pressure fuel pump's responsibility to force that fuel through the injector. So yeah, if it's not getting diesel, then obviously it's not going to run, but give it some easy start and it fired right up. Quick look at what other codes are appearing on the diagnostics. So ignore the 2 throttle ones. we've got fuel rail system pressure too low. So that to me says the fuel pressure is just not high enough to push through the injectors, which is what I mentioned earlier. We were getting fuel coming up the fuel lines, but if it wasn't a rate to which it should be, it won't be able to force through the injector. So that to me says it's potentially the high pressure fuel pump. Okay, so I think I'm going to leave the video there. I think it's been a pretty productive one, and I hope you've enjoyed watching the content. Yeah, I think if you stay tuned for the next episode, we'll dive a little bit more into the fueling and see if we can get the thing started and running. Who knows? It's a big ask, but we will see. Thank you so much for watching this episode. Thank you to everyone who subscribed. The channel has just clocked over 1,000 people. And to me, that is just crazy. So yeah, thank you so much for that. If you're new watching this, you know, give it a like, give it a subscribe. Only if you want to, you know, no pressure from me. Just do it if you want to. Anyway, I'm going to sign off. So thank you again so much for watching. Stay tuned for the next one, and I hope to see you then. Good night.